All right, this is gonna be my first video. This is my name is Dr. Justin Berry. I'm a psychologist. I've been thinking about starting I don't know, podcast or something for a long time. Lots of different topics come to my mind. Lots of different thoughts. I feel like I got to get them out somewhere. I have really a lot of privilege in supervising interns and chatting with really very talented and layered folks in therapy, but I feel like I need another outlet. And so this is going to be it. I want these videos hopefully to be just kind of not edited. This is kind of stream of consciousness stuff. So you're going to get maybe a mixed bag out of me depending on how I'm doing. And the topics hopefully would be pretty random. So this is number one. One of the things that's been bugging me for a while, and I really want to write about because I think it's good to have visuals of this concept as well. It's hard, I think, to talk out loud about it, but I'll give it a shot. So I do psychological testing, I do psychotherapy, again, supervision, training, leadership development, all sorts of stuff like that. And this is, I think, a pretty universal concept that I would use across the board in all the jobs and duties that I hold. It's the idea of like, how do we understand how human beings change over time? The concept of like change over time. And the reason why this is so important is one, I can't speak for every grad school program out there, but I don't think it's taught a bunch. I should note that I'm a psychodynamic clinician by trade, relational psychodynamic, so you're going to hear a lot of ideology on that end of the fence. But I think one of the consequences of a really medicalized system that tends to befriend more on the CBT, the cognitive behavioral therapy side, than the psychodynamic, humanistic, existential side, one of the consequences is that we've kind of trapped ourselves in this ideology that we have a diagnosis with a set of symptoms, and thereby it's going to be responsive to a particular type of intervention. And that's not inaccurate, but the problem, I would argue, is that it's leaving a huge, just like an iceberg. Like, we got the diagnosis and the symptoms up here, so we're going to intervene here, but there is a huge iceberg underneath that iceberg. Is there a name for the part underneath the iceberg? Anyway, the part under the water is what we're talking about here. So why would someone respond more positively to like a 12-session CBT intervention for depression? And then I can meet other folks in my community mental health work that have had protracted depression for years. I mean, decades even. Like, what is the difference between these two things? Now, one of the premises here that I will not have time to address today is personality. I think personality is probably one of the bigger answers of why folks don't get better, but we just are not good at it as a profession. Psychodynamic folks have been on top of this for years. Not always the best. I mean, I'm not saying we're perfect, but we've had ways of conceptualizing personality for a while. But for the purposes of today, what we're talking about is change over time. You got to be careful with me because I have a tendency to deviate with ideas. So change over time. So why would someone, back to the premise, why would someone be responsive to a 12-session or heck, even like a 4 or 5-session intervention with a behavioral health consultant? Behavioral health consultants are folks that are embedded into primary care, not always, but very typically, very short-term care. You come in, talk to your doctor, you take a screener, doctor shows a little bit of depression. They might toss you over to a behavioral health consultant, they'll problem solve with you, boom, off you go. And a lot of people respond to that. But why do other people not? So the premise here is that if I telescope way out, there's 3 overarching stages of change for human beings. Now, there is going to be a lot of nuance underneath these, and I can always go into them further some other time. But at a macro level, there's the need to ground, there's the need to observe, and then there is the need to act. And so what our field is really preoccupied with is action. But action is predicated by a lot of underlying human components that really make the action effective. Or a different way of putting it, because sometimes it's effective in the short term for a lot of folks, but effective in the long term. Like, how do we make sure that an intervention really leads to meaningful change over time, over years? Because that is technically our goal in the mental health field, is not to have people repeatedly coming back forever and ever, amen. We're trying to get them out on their own and more nimble and more flexible so that they get better and they can start solving problems for themselves and generalizing what we teach them. I mean, that is the ultimate goal. But again, we want a symptom for a disease. It's a whole other episode, I suppose, of me talking about disease. And so we give them a solution so they're good, right? Like, no, not so. So we need to ground, we need to observe, and then we get to action. Now, for those of, if any of y'all are like versed in trauma work, this might already sound somewhat familiar to you because our trauma folks, the folks in this field have been doing a great job using this ideology already, especially when we talk about like grounding. Grounding is super essential. I shouldn't leave out the somatic folks. I know that's kind of a new popular wave here. But if we cannot fundamentally ground, we're not going to be able to, from like a physiological level, be able to observe very well. And then if we can't do either of those, I don't know how the hell we're going to be acting, moving into an action phase. And it's funny, the more I think about it, it's like sports psychology. I mean, there's so many realms that already kind of talk about this model. So, I hope that means it holds some degree of truth. Now, what I add to it is I think about it from an attachment lens and like a developmental lens, like where are we at developmentally? Because these needs map on with human development relatively well. Again, super telescoped out. There's definitely some details that'll be missing, but in general. So let's start with the grounding piece. So the grounding piece, again, trauma folks have been on top of for a while, because if you don't give people skills to ground themselves when strong emotions, strong memories come up, they're not going to be able to really inhabit the space in a way that's productive. And so at a fundamental level, if someone's super panicky, super anxious, just, affectively just either in the dumps and just not activating at all, or just way too activated, you've got to get them back down to a facilitative level. Again, performance psychology talks a ton about this already, that facilitative level of emotion versus that debilitative level where it's just going to be too much. But I take it a step further, because that's like the more obvious, concrete version of grounding. It's absolutely essential, absolutely important, but there's other layers to it. So one of the things, and I feel like this is especially true in any sort of westernized society, is there is a tendency to be running on all cylinders a lot of the time. And there are consequences for this. I mean, it can create a lot of productivity, a lot of generativity, an ability to act quickly and efficiently. But one of the problems is it rushes people, and it allows people to operate at high levels of stress and anxiety. That doesn't mean that they're like, if I was to observe someone doing this, I wouldn't be like, oh, they're not grounded. I wouldn't be able to tell that right away. But if you really try to get them to slow down, they have a hard time slowing down. Like fundamentally saying like, where are you at? And so for sure, if I have somebody coming in anxious and their heart's pounding and they're like, can't even sit still, it's like, fundamental grounding, right? But I'll give you another example of somebody who falls into this category that needs to do a better job with grounding, and we need to do work grounding, is somebody who comes in, they're highly functional, been doing great in lots of spheres of their life. But then they come in and they're like, there's this problem that's been vexing me for a decade, 2 decades, 40 years, right? To which a red flag goes up for me, because people in general are very intelligent. If they have a set of kind of understanding about themselves and they're thinking flexibly, they probably would have solved the problem by now. But something has gotten in their way. So me just like jumping and colluding with this and going like, oh, you want action? Okay, I'll give you a bunch of action, is probably not the wisest idea. Now, some people will say like, well, you just give them action, and if they fail out of that, I don't like that term, but if they don't do well with it, then you maybe have your answer. You got to rewind first. But I don't know, if you have someone who's had an intractable, really challenging problem for a long time, I would say start at the beginning. Take nothing for granted and maybe rewind a bit and look at how they ground. Like, how can they actually slow down? And so with those types of folks, I'm spending a lot of time like, whoa. Why are you so busy doing and trying to get into doing phase? Because how's that been working out for you? And often the answer is like, not super well. So how do we get you like slowing down and noticing what's going on? Now, what's interesting about folks, to add a layer of complexity, we're still talking about grounding here, is that you have different personality styles too. Some people are more in the intellectual realm, and other folks are more in the emotional realm, and then lots of mixtures in between. Ideally, the most successful people can borrow from both. I mean, they might lead with one more than the other, but they're ambidextrous, if you will. They're able to use both logic and emotion relatively well. And so the slowing down process is synonymous for folks who are both over intellectualizers as well as folks who are highly sensitive. But the goals are slightly different. So you've got an intellectualizer. These are typically your type A's that are absolutely in the action realm. They want to be there. So the example I just used, they just want to be rolling all the time. Slowing them down and be like, what? Whoa, like, what are you feeling? Like, how are you noticing what's coming up for you in any given day versus how much you're just so busy translating data into possible solutions that you're actually, are you actually paying attention? Whereas if it's more on the emotional side, they might not be going into action. Yeah, many times they get so consumed by their emotions they get stuck and they don't know how to get to action. In those cases, it's about kind of calming the system down. So you notice one kind of more calming and the other is kind of approaching, trying to find a way to a middle ground where somebody is more balanced and more in tune with themselves. This is where like the mindfulness movement has been. I know it's kind of a cliche term. Even I roll my eyes sometimes when I hear it because like, the hell does that mean anymore? It's been so appropriated and used synonymously with everything, but it's truly an important movement because it talks about this too, of like, how are we actually being mindful about like where we're at? So just to give you kind of an idea and apply it, I'll share about myself. I will try to do this a lot in these videos because I think it's important, just, you know, for transparency. I'm not like some superhuman over here. So I'm a bit of an intellectualizer. I think if that wasn't already evident in how I'm talking here, but if I go back, I think just from a personality level, I just do that. You know, you put me in nature and I will ground real easy, but you put me in any other sort of circumstance, I cannot slow this thing down. It is just flying all over the place, and it's an asset in many ways, but it can also be a liability. And so if I'm going into therapy, people got to slow me down, be like, whoa, what are you feeling? And I've had to do this work personally as well as a therapist. Like I have to more frequently, especially as a relational psychodynamic therapist, I have to be able to slow down and be like, I'm hearing a lot of content that intellectually is curious to me, but I'm going to slow the heck down and say, I am feeling and I'm noticing something else in the room that I want to attend to rather than all that neat stuff that you just told me. And so I've had to learn that flexibility because I have to find my own way to ground. Would anyone prior to any of this say that, in my intellectual world, was I like an ungrounded person? They would say no, because the stereotype again is somebody who's like flustered and all out of sorts. But no. I had to learn how to like truly ground myself and figure out what's going on for me so I stopped screwing up my life and stopped living in intellectual land all the time. Such an important foundational skill set for folks. Now we talk about attachments. Again, we're talking about grounding. Talk about attachment and development. Grounding is one of the earliest skills that we learn. It is absolutely necessary during infancy. I mean, so much of what we're trying to do is feel sufficiently safe. And if you've taken any courses on like why is like that base level of safety so important, it gives the kid permission to then actually go out and start exploring the world. And from a fundamental standpoint, if you are activated and feel super unsafe, you are not going to be engaging the world in a very curious way, which is detrimental to growth, absolutely detrimental to growth. So then we get to the observation period. And this is really important. So we've sufficiently grounded, we're able to kind of manage our emotions. We're not talking like absence emotion. We're not like full stoicism here. Like we're able to kind of notice what's going on inside of us. And then we get to observe. Now, lots of folks will be doing pretty okay in the grounding phase, but the issue then translates into the observation phase too. Or it doesn't translate into, the issue can become in the observation phase. And the reason for this is the best way that we observe, I used this word earlier, the healthiest we can be is if we observe things flexibly. We don't hold ourselves to a really narrow scope or range of understanding things. I'll skip ahead here a little bit. Like developmentally, we talk about abstraction versus concreteness. it's a really interesting age for observation, because the initial observation is more about like facts and basic if-thens, right, wrongs, black, whites. We have to start with that really concrete stuff. But as we get older, we're talking childhood and we're going into teenage years, we start to add a lot of abstraction and gray into it. And so one of the really important things is that as we get older, we have enough experiences and we have enough attachments in our life that say like, hey, you could think of it this way or you could think of it this way. When I talk to folks who've been in like debate classes, that's why they love debate so much, because they always had to take an opposing point of view to understand where an opposite argument might be coming from. So critical thinking is super huge in the observation realm, because it talks a lot about, well, I won't conflate those two things, the observation, the critical thinking, but then curiosity is the other big piece. So families who and people who teach others to be curious is vital for this stage, because if you're not curious, you will go very quickly from observation into action. The way I define curiosity, one of my favorite words is curiosity is the ability to engage in wonder without the necessity for action. And so if kids and we can get to a place to where we're sitting there going like, this is the possible thing that's going on, but these are the other possibilities too, we do way, way better in life. Unfortunately, adversity, traumas, our own kind of personality quirks, our own preferences, psychological defenses, just how we kind of deal with any sort of challenging experience or challenging emotion inside of us can lead us astray and get us thinking very narrowly. And so, again, thinking from a therapeutic standpoint, we're getting people to ground. Can they get sufficiently ground? But then, can they observe in a more robust way and really think of alternatives? Now, CBT, I was kind of implying this kind of short-term evidence-based stuff gets a bad rap. It's not totally bad, because, even cognitive behavioral therapy talks a lot about how do we think and how do we perceive. And in third wave ones are doing an especially good job at this. The ACT, kind of schema-based ones, they're doing better at really teaching people to understand why they work the way that they work. So again, using that example of the really high-functioning folks that, going throughout their life, but then they're stuck on this one singular issue. We're first teaching them to ground, and then very quickly also getting them into an observational stance that considers things outside of themselves. And this is the power of the third eye. The relational psychodynamic approach says, like, we rely upon relationships to do these things because it's hard to see outside of our own heads. We need alternative perspectives, and this is where therapists come in very, very handy. If you kind of understand developmental trajectories and backgrounds and how people think about things or different schemas or those sorts of things, because it equips people with a unique or new way of seeing things. And that is absolutely important and imperative to get them into action that actually has longitudinal change, right? Longitudinal implications. So, am I missing anything? So we got ground, which is, again, synonymous with early childhood. We're not talking just overt, get me out of a panic state. We're talking like actually ground and inhabit yourself. Number two, as you're inhabiting yourself, are you sufficiently observing and understanding why you work the way that you work? And especially true for folks who've been stuck on it for a long time. The answer is not always in the present. It is often in the past. Some people say the psychodynamic approaches are all about the past and they just live in the past. Nuh-uh. We look at the past because we're trying to figure out what the hell is going wrong in the present. And if we don't understand the way I described to folks, if we don't understand the chapters of the book leading to the current chapter, how the hell are we going to write new chapters in a different way? Like, we're probably not, out of like chance or epiphany or random insight. So getting people to observe more flexibly, start to notice cycles, unhealthy cycles, things that aren't working for folks, and now we're getting them ready for the action phase. But we're not done yet. Because even the action phase is going to look a little bit different depending on the individual. Again, there's some people they've already been able to ground, they observe flexibly enough, they have enough sort of diversity of experience and exposure and willingness to perspective take and see things differently that they can take action and run with it. However, there are certain topics and certain needs that the action phase in of itself is not action and you're done. And again, this is where we go back to a developmental mindset. And the likelihood of this increases the more you've had to go to earlier stages and the frequency at which you've had to go to earlier stages. So as an example, if you had to work through somebody from a grounding perspective for a while, say you were working on ground for like 6 months or a year, and then you do observation, more than likely if the grounding took that long, the observation at least another 6 months or a year. You get to the action phase, it is not uncommon for these individuals to need more time in therapy before they're out there on their own. If you're following along with my wild brain, the reason for that is the action phase is synonymous with adolescence. We're talking about teenage years. And for some people, kind of going into the early 20s. Now, it depends on the attachment and those sorts of things, but generally speaking, for teenagers, what they do is they're out there exploring things, which is exactly what they need to be doing. If they've sufficiently learned how to ground, they know themselves well enough, they go out there and start testing more and more and more. And I kind of joke, they just start fires and screw shit up. That's kind of the storminess of adolescence, is just you're going to mess up. You need to mess up. And sometimes they will self-correct, but in an ideal situation, they can still come back and check in with somebody. Not always, not all the time. They're far more independent if things are going well. But they need still that secure base to come back and check in with. So even the short-term CBT people are serving this purpose. Hey, do you need to check back in with me? But I can guarantee if someone's really been having a hard time moving through these earlier phases, they're really going to want that and really going to need that, because this is where the parallel falls apart. They're not kids anymore. If you're well, I'm saying that because I work with adults, but if you're seeing a 40-year-old who's working through these stages, it is not uncommon that the bad habits and defenses that have been instituted over those decades are going to take a while to kind of crumble. So they're gonna have an experiential drift back towards these bad habits, because that's kind of how human beings work. Again, they wouldn't be coming to see you with a decades-long issue had they been able to figure it out themselves. So there's going to be that drift back, and so there is this sort of process where the action phase is actually a repetition back into the cycle of how do we get back to an observation phase? Ooh, that was a really tough experience. All right, how are we grounding and moving back into observation and getting you back into an action phase? And that takes time. That's not going to be a 12-session intervention. And again, unless they are really healthy and all these things have been ironed out and really robust for them already. This is especially true if you work with trauma. You've already probably put these pieces together. If you've had a lot of protracted trauma, not everybody. Adversity shapes people for the better too. We need to be remembered. It's not I've had adversity, so that means I'm broken. That's not how that works. Adversity is one of the best shapers of human beings. It's a really weird relationship we have with tragedy. It's we don't want tragedy to happen, and yet invariably tragedy shapes people in super important ways. So I don't want to communicate just because somebody has trauma means they're deficient in all these things. It's not the case. Do not underestimate the power of human resiliency. Folks can do extremely well going through trauma. However, incident rates of these difficulties with grounding and observation are higher when people have had traumas. It just fractures people's understanding of themselves and others, the object relations, as we say in psychodynamic world. It's just so messed up. They really have a hard time objectively grounding and figuring out who they are and figuring out safety with people, never mind observing themselves and others in the world in an accurate way to engage in meaningful action. And so you're often cycling back through to make sure the grounding is secure, the observation is secure and robust and begins to generalize outside of a narrow window of what they're conquering. And so you're going to cycle back through several times. This doesn't mean that you keep people in treatment forever. There still is this launch period like we do with kids that that's enough. You're going to have to figure out this one on your own. But we alter it a little bit based on where somebody is at and the complexity of the problems. Again, personality is a major modifier. Can't talk about personality today. It's already long enough. But that's kind of the idea is you're going to need more time. So kind of summarizing, we got action, we've got observation, and then action, observation. I went backwards. Grounding, observation, and action, and that this is not a linear process. There is a cycling back that hopefully over time, as you've got a grounding, observation, action, kind of got an upward trend, but then you kind of loop back and go maybe back to observation, then back up to action, and hopefully there's this incline that gets them to a point where it's like, we don't need to do treatment anymore right now. This episode of care doesn't need to go on. You need to go out and test this out for yourself. But again, it's this kind of wave that goes up. So it's really important, because if we get trapped into this short-term treatment mindset too much, half of people, and this might be too generous, half of people will respond to that. But what happens to those other half? What happens to that other half? Especially if you don't have therapists who are trained to think about this sort of thing. Because what helps me the most, because I get stuck with clients all the time, it's inevitable. You can't keep your third eye all the time. What really helps me is to pause and telescope out and say, where are they at? Like, what are these fundamental skill sets? And again, the psychodynamic literature has more than just these three, but like, where are they at in their arc? And am I understanding this arc in a way that's efficient? And the biggest thing is, like, how do I then not just give them, like, not get them to a place where they're healthier, but they internalize and understand these phases themselves? You know, a lot of us therapists, you know, kind of cringe when folks come in and say, like, I don't know, doc, you tell me, you got all the answers, you got the degree on the wall, right? And you're like, come on, like, no, you're ultimately going to have the answers, which is mostly true, but it's not all true. We do need to be equipped with things that most people will not encounter. And to me, this idea of, you know, change over time is one of those things that we as providers really need to own. We need to have some sort of sensible model so that we're not just in the weeds with clients, but we periodically telescope out ourselves, but then telescope out with them and say, let's notice. Let's be curious about this arc. How can I give you language to kind of understand what you're doing and why you're doing it? Because people will sometimes be like, well, I'm back, that action didn't work, and I'm back in an observation, but they're not saying it in that language. They're saying it as they failed, they haven't been successful, or whatever it is. But if we give folks this sort of idea of, like, this is what change can look like, it gives them a model and a map to go, oh, of course, like, how can I not be back in a grounding phase? That's the thing I haven't been very good at. And so naturally, when I'm out there finally going out and taking risks, it's gonna screw with my emotions. I'm not gonna just be, gotta be careful you use the word, I'm massively resilient overnight. Of course I'm gonna come back to this. And that's exactly where I need to be. Or, I noticed I had sort of a similar mindset I typically do, and I know where that comes from, so I know I got to go back to that observation phase. I totally get it. And that's going to prepare me for action again. And it's not that I'm delaying or that I failed. Like, it's okay that I need to recuperate and kind of recollect before I go straight back out into action again. Of course I need that. Like, how could I not? This is where kind of trauma therapists and stuff do a really good job. It might sound cliche these days, but they'll say stuff like, well, how would you treat, like, the 14-year-old you or the 12-year-old you? And the beauty of what they're doing is they're essentially saying, like, think of yourself in, like, a narrative format. Like, think of yourself more than just this adult that's supposed to be not massively, just, like, magically functioning without any, flaws. Like, that's not how it works. You got to think of yourself developmentally. You're great in some areas, but there are these other areas you're needing to move through, and there is a process and there is a method to that. So trying to think if there's anything else. I think that's the majority of it. Yeah. Ground, observe, act. We talked about the attachment levels, the sort of different age ranges that these tasks are really important in to increase independence. We talked about how people's, how that's going to vary across people. I didn't go into depth into why people vary. In the psychodynamic, we call it kind of organizational level, why people vary. And it might sound really, like, judgmental, but it really isn't. It just tries to appreciate people from really a depth-based perspective of why people are at different levels, and they can move. They're not, like, stuck there. Can't do the personality thing. Trying to think if there's anything else. I don't think so. I'm sure I'll think of it, but that's the problem. This is, again, spur of the moment. So I guess that's where we'll end, and this is the end of my inaugural video. See if I end up posting it, but Yeah, if you did listen, thanks for listening. I hope it's been at least curiosity provoking. It's the main thing I want to do. And yeah, we'll see what I end up publishing next. Thanks so much.